I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and which part of the day has always been your favourite, and why? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Tea taken at 3:30. The first week of May had arrived in St Mary Mead with that particular gentleness which makes the English spring so treasured by those who must endure the uncertainties of April. The air held warmth without heaviness, and the gardens along the high street displayed their early roses with quiet satisfaction. It was the sort of weather that encouraged open windows, light cardigans, and the feeling that all was well with the world. Miss Marple, standing at her gate that Wednesday afternoon, observed the comings and goings with the mild interest of one who has lived long enough to know that the surface of village life often tells a different story from what lies beneath. She had been deadheading her early tulips, and now paused to rest her hands, which had grown less reliable with the passing years. Across the lane and 3 houses down stood the neat brick residence of Mr. Stephen Rowley, a retired solicitor who had come to St Mary Mead some 20 years previous, upon the death of his mother. He was a bachelor of 68, methodical in his habits and pleasant in his manner, though not one who encouraged intimacy. His life appeared to run with the regularity of a well-maintained clock, and the village had grown accustomed to seeing his tall, slightly stooped figure walking to the post office each morning at 10 and returning home by past. Miss Marple had observed, as she observed most things, that Mr. Rowley took his afternoon tea at precisely 3:30 each day. One could set one's watch by the sight of Mrs. Crane, his housekeeper, drawing the sitting-room curtains back to their afternoon position at 3:20, and the subsequent appearance of the tea-tray, carried with the purposeful step of one who has performed the same service for many years. Mrs. Edith Crane had been in Mr. Rowley's employ for 15 years, a period of service that had earned her the village's respect and, it must be said, a certain proprietary air regarding her employer's household. She was a woman of 52, sturdy in build and decisive in manner, with iron-grey hair worn in neat waves and a habitual expression that suggested she knew exactly what needed doing and would brook no interference in the doing of it. She had come to Mr. Rowley as a widow with some savings and no children, and had made his comfort and welfare her life's work with the thoroughness of one who has found her proper occupation. It was therefore not surprising that when Mrs. Winifred Lowe from the house directly opposite called, at 3:30 that Wednesday, she found the tea laid out with customary precision. Mrs. Lowe was a plump, amiable woman of 45 who had moved to St. Mary Mead 3 years earlier, following the death of her husband, a commercial traveller. She had a cheerful disposition and a tendency to drop in on her neighbours with a frequency that some found excessive, though Mr. Rowley, with his natural courtesy, had never given any indication that her visits were unwelcome. Indeed, it had become something of a routine that Mrs. Lowe should call on Wednesday afternoons, when Mrs. Crane served tea in the sitting-room, rather than in the study where Mr. Rowley generally preferred to take it. The sitting-room was a pleasant space with a bow window looking onto the front garden, furnished with chairs upholstered in a dark green fabric, and a bookcase containing volumes that appeared more decorative than frequently consulted. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its steady tick a reassuring presence in the quiet house. On this particular Wednesday, Mrs. Lowe arrived promptly, as was her custom, and was shown into the sitting-room by Mrs. Crane. Mr. Rowley rose from his chair by the fireplace, though no fire burned at this season, and greeted his visitor with his usual punctilious politeness. "My dear Mrs. Lowe, how kind of you to call. I trust I find you well?" "Quite well, Mr. Rowley, thank you, though I confess the weather makes one feel that one ought to be doing something terribly energetic, which is most inconvenient when one would rather sit quietly with a cup of tea." Mr. Rowley smiled, that small smile of a man who appreciates gentle humour without feeling compelled to add to it. Mrs. Crane poured the tea with practised efficiency, and the conversation settled into the comfortable pattern of village news and mild observations about the season. It was noted later by those who examined the events of that afternoon with closer attention that Mr. Rowley had seemed in his usual health. He had taken his customary walk that morning, had spoken to the postmaster about the possibility of rain later in the week, and had mentioned to Mrs. Crane that he felt the sitting room might benefit from a thorough airing, as the spring warmth made closed rooms somewhat oppressive. Mrs. Crane, in her subsequent account, reported that the afternoon had proceeded normally in every respect. Tea was poured at 3:30. Mr. Rowley had taken his chair, the one slightly angled toward the window, and Mrs. Lowe had settled into the chair opposite. Conversation had been unremarkable, touching on the vicar's sermon from the previous Sunday, and the question of whether the village fete should be held on the first or second Saturday in June. At 3:45, Mrs. Lowe had risen to leave, conscious as always of not overstaying her welcome. She had thanked Mr. Rowley for the tea, remarked on the pleasant afternoon, and departed through the front door with Mrs. Crane seeing her out in the proper fashion. It was perhaps 5 minutes later, when Mrs. Crane returned to the sitting room to clear the tea things, that she found Mr. Rowley still seated in his chair, but with his head fallen slightly to one side and his eyes closed. Her first thought, she said, was that he had dozed off, as gentlemen of his age sometimes did after tea. But when she spoke his name and received no response, and when she touched his hand and found it already cooling, she understood with that terrible clarity that comes in such moments that Mr. Rowley was no longer sleeping, but had passed beyond all waking. Dr. Haydock arrived within 20 minutes of being summoned. His solid, reassuring presence a comfort to Mrs. Crane, who had maintained her composure with admirable steadiness. The doctor's examination was brief but thorough, and his conclusion was delivered with the gentle certainty of one who has attended many such scenes. Heart failure, I'm afraid. He complained to me only Monday of feeling what he called a flutter. I advised rest and told him I would call on Friday to check on him. These things can come on quite suddenly at his age. Mrs. Crane nodded, her face pale but controlled. He did mention feeling tired this past week. I urged him to take things easily. I'm sure you did, Dr. Haydock said kindly. There's nothing you could have done differently. These matters are in other hands than ours. By early evening the news had made its quiet way through St. Mary Mead, as such news invariably does. Miss Marple heard it from Lady Bantry, who had heard it from the vicar's wife, who had heard it from Mrs. Crane herself when the poor woman had gone to the vicarage to request that the vicar call at his earliest convenience. Poor Mr. Rowley, Lady Bantry said, shaking her head. Though I suppose it was quick, which is a mercy. Mrs. Crane must be quite shaken after all those years of service. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I imagine she must be, though Mrs. Crane has always struck me as a very capable woman, the practical sort who carries on regardless. Still, it must be a shock, and what will she do now, I wonder? Miss Marple did not answer directly, but she stood for a moment at her window, looking down the lane toward Mr. Rowley's house. Something Lady Bantry had said in passing had caught in her mind, small and troubling as a caught thread. Mr. Rowley never let his tea go cold, she murmured. I remember him saying once that tea was meant to be drunk hot, not lukewarm. He was most particular about it. But she said nothing more, and when Lady Bantry departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with that quiet, thoughtful expression that meant her mind was elsewhere, turning over some small detail that did not quite fit with the rest. Chapter 2. A Cup That Cooled. Too quickly. The day following Mr. Rowley's death brought with it the particular quietness that descends upon a village when something unexpected has occurred. It was not grief precisely, for Mr. Rowley had not been a man who invited deep attachment, but rather that slight awkwardness which comes when the usual pattern of things has been disrupted, and no one is quite certain how to proceed. Miss Marple, having given the matter some thought during the night, decided that it would be entirely proper to call upon Mrs. Crane. Not immediately, of course, for that would suggest either unseemly curiosity or an assumption of greater intimacy than actually existed. But perhaps by mid-morning, when the first shock would have subsided somewhat and company might be welcome, she put on her second-best hat, the one with the modest brim that suggested serious purpose without solemnity, and took with her a small pot of honey from her own bees. It was the sort of offering that could be received without obligation, neither too grand nor too trivial. The walk to Mr. Rowley's house took no more than 5 minutes, and Miss Marple found herself noticing details she might ordinarily have passed without conscious observation. The garden showed signs of recent attention. The edges of the lawn had been trimmed with precision, and the border flowers stood in neat rows. Mrs. Crane, she reflected, would not allow standards to slip merely because her employer had died. There was something admirable in that, and something else too, though Miss Marple could not quite have said what. Mrs. Crane answered the door herself, dressed in a black dress that looked as though it had been waiting in the wardrobe for just such an occasion. Her face was composed, perhaps a shade paler than usual, but her eyes were dry and her manner as brisk as ever. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call." "I hope I do not intrude, Mrs. Crane. I wished only to offer my sympathies and to bring you this small token." She held out the honey jar, and Mrs. Crane took it with a nod of acknowledgement. "You're very thoughtful. Will you come in? I was just about to make myself some tea. The house feels rather empty, and one must occupy oneself somehow." Miss Marple followed her into the hallway, noting that the house retained its air of orderliness despite the upheaval. Not a book was out of place, not a cushion askew. They proceeded to the sitting room, and it was here that Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained placidly sympathetic. The room looked exactly as one would expect a sitting room to look on a May morning, with sunlight falling across the carpet in a pleasant slant, and the windows open to admit the spring air. And yet something about it gave Miss Marple pause, though she could not immediately have said what. Mrs. Crane moved to close one of the windows. "I opened them early this morning to freshen the room," she said. "It seemed necessary somehow." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, "fresh air is always restorative." While Mrs. Crane went to prepare the tea, Miss Marple remained standing, looking about the room with that gentle, vague expression that concealed considerable attention to detail. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. The books on their shelves looked undisturbed, and yet her gaze returned again and again to the small table beside the chair where Mr. Rowley had died, the chair that was now empty and somehow accusatory in its emptiness. Mrs. Crane returned with the tea tray, and they settled into the chairs by the window. The tea was strong and hot, served with the same efficiency that Mrs. Crane brought to all domestic matters. "It must have been a terrible shock," Miss Marple ventured, adding milk to her cup with careful attention. "Yes and no," Mrs. Crane replied, and there was something almost defiant in her tone. "Dr. Haydock had warned him, you know. Mr. Rowley was not a young man, and he would persist in walking every morning regardless of the weather. I told him more than once that he ought to take greater care." "I am sure you did. You were very devoted to his welfare." "I did my duty," Mrs. Crane said, and her voice softened slightly. "For 15 years I looked after him, and I may say without immodesty that I knew his habits better than anyone. He was not an easy man in some ways, Miss Marple, very particular about his routines, very set in his preferences, but we understood each other." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I imagine yesterday afternoon proceeded as usual. I understand Mrs. Lowe was here for tea." "Yes, she comes every Wednesday. Mr. Rowley found her rather trying, if I may speak candidly now that he's gone, but he was too much the gentleman to discourage her visits." Mrs. Crane paused and added, "The tea was laid out at the usual time. Everything was as it should be. And Mr. Rowley seemed quite well. Quite. Perhaps a touch tired, but nothing to cause alarm. He spoke to Mrs. Lowe about the vicar's sermon and the village fete, drank his tea." She stopped abruptly, and a small frown crossed her face. "That is, I assumed he drank his tea. In truth, when I came back to clear away, his cup was still rather full. But then, the shock of dying would have prevented him, would it not?" "One would suppose so," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though it does seem curious that he should have been taken ill before finishing his tea, when you say he seemed well when you poured it." Mrs. Crane stood and moved to the sideboard, her movements suddenly restless. "I confess I did not think of it at the time. One acts without thinking in such circumstances. I tidied the tea things away quite mechanically. The cup was washed before I even realised what I was doing. Dr. Haydock said that in cases of heart failure the end can come very suddenly." "Indeed it can," Miss Marple said, She set down her own cup with a small precise clink. "I notice you have sugar on the tray, Mrs. Crane. Did Mr. Rowley take sugar in his tea?" "One lump always. He was most particular about it." "And the teaspoon? Would it have shown traces of sugar, do you suppose, or did he stir it thoroughly?" Mrs. Crane's frown deepened. "I cannot say I noticed, Miss Marple. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely idle curiosity. One forms such pictures in one's mind of these things. I myself am quite careless about stirring, and my spoon often shows quite visible sugar crystals. But gentlemen of Mr. Rowley's generation were generally more thorough in such matters." There was a brief silence, and Miss Marple could see Mrs. Crane turning this over in her mind, though what conclusions she drew were not apparent. "Mrs. Lowe," Miss Marple continued in the same conversational tone, "she must have been most distressed to learn what happened so shortly after her departure." "She was," Mrs. Crane said shortly. "She came round yesterday evening in quite a state, saying she ought to have noticed something, ought to have realised. I told her there was nothing anyone could have done. When the heart decides to fail, it fails, and there's an end to it." "Very true, and yet one cannot help but wonder about these things. You said Mr. Rowley drank very little of his tea?" "I may have been mistaken," Mrs. Crane said, and there was a note of irritation in her voice now. "In the shock of the moment, one's recollections are not always reliable. Perhaps he drank more than I thought. The cup may have appeared fuller than it was." "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Memory plays such tricks. I am forever thinking I have done things I have not done, or the reverse. It is most vexing." She rose to leave shortly thereafter, thanking Mrs. Crane for the tea and expressing once more her sympathy. As she walked back down the lane toward her own cottage, her face wore that thoughtful, slightly puzzled expression that meant she was considering something that did not quite fit. A man who never let his tea go cold, who was particular about his single lump of sugar, who seemed quite well at 3:30 and was dead by 4 o'clock, and a cup that was washed before anyone thought to look at it closely, a teaspoon that might or might not have shown traces of sugar, and a housekeeper who had tidied away the evidence of that final tea before the doctor had even been summoned. Small things, perhaps, insignificant things, and yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that small things could matter very much indeed, particularly when they concern the final moments of a man's life. Chapter 3. The window left open for air. Miss Marple had learned over her many years that information in a village flowed in curious patterns, rather like water finding its way downhill. One could not simply demand to know things, but if one was patient and receptive, the knowledge came of its own accord, often from the most unexpected sources. It was on Friday morning, 2 days after Mr. Rowley's death, that Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Lowe in the greengrocer's shop. The poor woman looked rather worn, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of restless nights. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Lowe said, with that eagerness people display when they wish to unburden themselves but lack a suitable opportunity, "I have been hoping to see you. I find myself quite unable to settle to anything. It is most distressing." "Death often affects us more than we anticipate," Miss Marple observed gently, selecting 3 apples with apparent concentration, "particularly when it occurs so unexpectedly and so near to us. That is precisely it. I keep thinking of Wednesday afternoon, going over it again and again in my mind. If only I had noticed something, said something, but he seemed perfectly well. We spoke of quite ordinary matters." Miss Marple paid for her apples and suggested, with that diffidence that never failed to achieve its object, that Mrs. Lowe might care to walk part of the way home with her. The suggestion was accepted with visible relief. Once they were out of the shop and walking slowly along the high street, Mrs. Lowe continued with barely a pause. "Mrs. Crane has been very kind, very understanding, but I cannot help feeling that she must think me quite foolish for not having observed anything amiss. And there is something that troubles me, though it seems such a small thing that I hesitate to mention it." "Small things," Miss Marple said, "are often the most revealing. One should never dismiss them simply because they appear insignificant." Mrs. Lowe glanced at her with something approaching gratitude. "You're very kind. The thing is this. When I arrived for tea on Wednesday, the sitting room was quite warm, almost stuffy. The day was mild, you understand, but Mr. Rowley always kept the room well heated. He felt the cold rather more than most people, or so he said. And yet, Miss Marple prompted quietly, sensing there was more. And yet when Mrs. Crane showed me in, she immediately went to open the window behind Mr. Rowley's chair. She said something about the room needing air, and Mr. Rowley made no objection, though I confess I thought he looked rather uncomfortable about it. He shifted in his chair, you see, as though the draught bothered him. Did he say anything? No, nothing. He was too courteous to contradict his housekeeper, particularly in front of a visitor. But I remember thinking at the time that it was unlike him. He once mentioned to me, quite emphatically, that he could not abide sitting in a draught. Said it made him feel as though he were being watched by invisible presences. Mrs. Lowe gave a small, apologetic laugh. It sounds rather foolish, I know. Not at all, Miss Marple assured her. Many people have such sensibilities. And the window remained open throughout your visit? Yes, though I noticed Mr. Rowley had angled his chair away from it slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to avoid the direct current of air. Mrs. Lowe paused at the corner where their paths diverged. Do you think it matters, Miss Marple? Mrs. Crane said he liked fresh air, but it seemed so contrary to his usual preferences. It may matter, or it may not, Miss Marple said carefully. Memory is often clearer a few days after an event than it is immediately following. You were quite right to mention it. After they parted, Miss Marple found herself thinking about that open window with increasing attention. It was another small detail, like the cup of tea that had been washed too quickly, that did not align with what she knew of Mr. Rowley's character and habits. That afternoon she paid a second visit to Mr. Rowley's house, this time with the excuse of a book she thought Mrs. Crane might find comforting. She was shown into the sitting room once more, and as they spoke of practicalities, the funeral arrangements, which were to be simple and private, and Mrs. Crane's plans for the future, Miss Marple let her gaze wander about the room with that vague, unfocused quality that suggested a mind occupied with other matters. The window was closed now, and the room held the stillness of a space no longer lived in. But Miss Marple could picture it as it must have been on Wednesday afternoon. The tea tray laid out, Mrs. Lowe settling into her chair, and Mrs. Crane opening the window before taking her own seat to pour. You must have found the room rather close on Wednesday, Miss Marple remarked, as though the thought had just occurred to her. I understand you opened the window for air. Mrs. Crane, who was sorting through a stack of condolence cards, glanced up briefly. Yes, the weather was so pleasant I thought fresh air would be beneficial. Mr. Rowley did not object. I am surprised to hear it. I had understood that he was rather particular about draughts. There was the smallest hesitation before Mrs. Crane replied. He could be inconsistent in his preferences, Miss Marple. Like many elderly gentlemen, he sometimes contradicted himself. One day he would insist the room was too warm, the next that it was too cold. I learned not to pay too much attention to every passing complaint. Of course. And where exactly were you sitting? Forgive my curiosity, but I find myself trying to picture the scene. Mrs. Crane indicated the chair nearest the tea table. There, as I always do when we have visitors. It allows me to pour without reaching awkwardly. Miss Marple rose and moved about the room with the aimless quality of one simply stretching her legs. She positioned herself where Mr. Rowley's chair stood, noting its angle relative to the window. From this position, the open window would have been directly behind the sitter, perhaps 2 feet away. A man sensitive to draughts would have been most uncomfortable. More than that, Miss Marple observed that the window, when open, commanded a clear view of the small garden below. And growing directly beneath that window, trained against the wall in the manner of cottage plants, was a healthy specimen of foxglove, its purple bells in full bloom. What lovely foxgloves you have, Miss Marple remarked, though one must be careful with them, of course. So beautiful, yet so very poisonous. Mrs. Patterson's son trims them for me, Mrs. Crane said, her attention still on the condolence cards. He was here just Wednesday morning, as it happens, cutting back the dead stalks. He's very good with growing things. Wednesday morning, Miss Marple repeated softly. She moved away from the window and returned to her seat. How efficient of him! They spoke of other matters for a few minutes more, and then Miss Marple took her leave. But as she walked home through the late afternoon sunshine, her mind was working with that quiet intensity that meant she was arranging pieces of a puzzle that most people would never have seen as connected. A window opened against habit, positioned directly above freshly trimmed foxgloves. A chair angled away from the draught, suggesting discomfort, and Mrs. Crane's brisk assertion that Mr. Rowley had not objected, when Mrs. Lowe's recollection suggested quite the opposite. Miss Marple thought of how air moves through an open window, carrying with it whatever scents or qualities exist in the space beyond. She thought of how quickly one might grow accustomed to a smell, particularly if one knew it was there and had reason to expect it. And she thought of Mr. Rowley, sitting with his back to that window, perhaps catching an unfamiliar bitterness in the air, perhaps feeling that vague unease that warns us when something is not quite right. The foxgloves nodded gently in her own garden as she passed them, innocent and lovely in the slanting light. But Miss Marple knew, as every country person knows, that beauty and danger often grow from the same root, and that the most careful preparations sometimes reveal themselves in the smallest details. Like a window opened at the wrong time, in defiance of long-established habit, on an afternoon when the air needed to carry something away. Chapter 4. A letter folded against habit. The funeral took place on Saturday morning, attended by those respectable members of the community who felt their presence was required by custom, if not by personal affection. Mr. Rowley had not been the sort of man to inspire deep sentiment, but St. Mary Mead understood its obligations to the departed, and the church was respectably filled. Miss Marple sat toward the back, observing as she always did the various gradations of grief and duty displayed by the congregation. Mrs. Crane sat in the front pew, dry-eyed and composed in her black dress, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap. Mrs. Lowe occupied a position several rows behind, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a handkerchief. There were others too, the vicar's wife, the postmaster, Lady Bantry, representing what passed for gentry in the village, all performing their parts in the familiar ritual. After the service, as the mourners gathered briefly in the churchyard, Miss Marple found herself standing near a tall, rather anxious-looking young man whom she recognised as Mr. Rowley's nephew, Gerald Rowley. He had arrived the previous evening from London, where he held some minor position in a firm of accountants. "You must be Miss Marple," he said, having been introduced by the vicar. "Uncle Stephen mentioned you in his letters, said you knew everything that happened in the village almost before it happened." Miss Marple smiled at this characterization. "Your uncle was perhaps too generous. I merely observe, as one does when one has lived in the same place for many years." "I wish I had visited more often," Gerald Rowley said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "But London is demanding, and Uncle Stephen always seemed so settled, so self-sufficient. Mrs. Crane wrote to inform me of his death. Very properly done, though the letter took a day to reach me. I came as soon as I could." "I am sure your uncle would have understood. He was a practical man, I believe." "Yes, practical to the core." Gerald paused, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Marple, may I ask you something rather peculiar? It concerns a letter I wrote to Uncle Stephen just last week. When I arrived yesterday to make arrangements, Mrs. Crane showed me into the study to collect any personal papers. I found my letter on his writing desk, but it had been opened and left unfolded. Uncle Stephen was meticulous about such things. He always folded letters properly and placed them in the left compartment of his desk. Always." Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained mildly sympathetic. Perhaps in the distress of the moment, Mrs. Crane opened it to see if it contained anything requiring immediate attention. That is what she said when I asked her about it, and I suppose it makes sense. But Uncle Stephen had written to me just the previous week, mentioning some changes he intended to make. I had replied to his letter, addressing certain questions he had raised about family matters. Nothing of great importance, you understand, but I did wonder why it had been opened at all, given that he died on Wednesday, and my letter only arrived that morning. You're certain of when it arrived? Mrs. Crane mentioned it when she showed me the letter. She said the post had come at the usual time, around 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, and she had placed it on the desk for Uncle Stephen to attend to when he came in from his walk. Gerald Rowley frowned slightly. The thing that struck me as odd was that the paper smelled rather peculiar. Not unpleasant exactly, but earthy, rather like garden plants. "How observant of you," Miss Marple murmured. "And you say the letter was left open on the desk, not folded, as your uncle would normally have arranged it?" "Precisely. Folded once, loosely, whereas Uncle Stephen always folded letters twice and creased them firmly. He was particular about it, said it prevented papers from becoming muddled. Mrs. Crane explained that she had opened it after his death, wanting to know if there was anything urgent, any instructions I might have sent. But I had posted it Monday, you see, and he died Wednesday. Surely if he had read it on Wednesday morning he would have folded it properly and put it away before tea time." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. Unless, of course, something prevented him from attending to his usual routine. Your uncle may have been more unwell than anyone realized. "Perhaps," Gerald said, though he sounded unconvinced. "Mrs. Crane assures me that he seemed quite himself on Wednesday morning. She's very insistent on that point." They parted shortly afterward, and Miss Marple made her way home slowly, her mind turning over this new detail. That evening, after a light supper, she sat in her parlour with her knitting, but the needles moved more slowly than usual as she thought about the letter that had been folded once instead of twice, that smelled of garden plants, and that Mrs. Crane claimed to have opened after Mr. Rowley's death. The following morning, being Sunday, Miss Marple attended church as was her custom. Afterward, she accepted an invitation to take tea with Lady Bantry at Gossington Hall, where the conversation naturally turned to the recent funeral. "Poor Mrs. Crane," Lady Bantry said, settling herself comfortably into her chair. 15 years of devoted service, and now she must start her life afresh. I understand Mr. Rowley left her a small bequest, but hardly enough to live on independently. She will need to find another position. Has she spoken of her plans? Not directly, but I gather from the vicar's wife that she intends to remain in the house for the time being. The nephew has no immediate need of it, and she is to sort through Mr. Rowley's effects and prepare an inventory. It may take some weeks. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. I understand Mr. Rowley had been considering changes to his will. Had he? I knew nothing of that. Where did you hear it? "Oh, merely village talk," Miss Marple said vaguely. "One hears these fragments of conversation, you know, and pieces them together afterward. I believe there was some discussion between Mr. Rowley and Mrs. Crane about future arrangements." Lady Bantry looked intrigued. "How very interesting. I wonder if that would have affected Mrs. Crane's situation. She must have been anxious about it after dedicating so many years to his care." "Anxiety," Miss Marple observed, "can lead people to act in ways they might not otherwise consider, particularly when one has come to regard something as rightfully one's own through long association." She did not elaborate on this thought, and Lady Bantry, distracted by the arrival of fresh scones, let the subject drift to other matters. But Miss Marple continued to consider the question of the letter, when it had truly been opened, and by whom, and why it should smell of garden leaves when it had supposedly lain undisturbed on a writing desk. A letter opened before death, not after. A letter that smelled of foxglove, which grew beneath the sitting-room window, and Mrs. Crane's insistence that she had opened it only after Mr. Rowley died, seeking urgent information. Miss Marple thought of how one might handle a piece of paper after one's hands had been busy with other tasks, trimming plants perhaps, or preparing something that required both secrecy and care. She thought of how anxiety might drive a person to search through correspondence, looking for reassurance about their future, about changes that had been mentioned but not yet enacted. And she thought of Mr. Rowley, meticulous to the last, who would never have left a letter folded carelessly on his desk when he had strict habits about such matters, habits maintained over many years. Small details, each insignificant alone. A cup washed too quickly, a window opened against preference, and now a letter that told a different story from the one Mrs. Crane wished it to tell. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm, but her eyes held that distant, calculating expression that meant she was no longer thinking of the pattern before her, but of another pattern entirely, one that was beginning to emerge from the confusion of details like a picture developing slowly in a photographer's tray, growing clearer with each passing moment. Chapter 5. Voices that spoke of gratitude. The days following the funeral brought with them that peculiar period of adjustment when a village must learn to accommodate an absence. For St. Mary Mead, Mr. Rowley's death represented less a profound loss than a subtle rearrangement of familiar patterns. The morning walk to the post office occurred without his tall, stooped figure. The solicitor's chair in the church remained empty, and gradually, as it always does, village life closed over the gap his departure had created. What did not diminish, Miss Marple observed, was the steady stream of commentary about Mrs. Crane's situation. It seemed that everyone had an opinion about what the poor woman should do now, where she might go, and, most frequently, what a tragedy it was that such devoted service should end in such uncertainty. Miss Marple heard these observations in the bakery, where Mrs. Finch declared that Mrs. Crane had given her whole life to Mr. Rowley, and deserved better than a modest bequest. She heard them again at the lending library, where Miss Hartnell pronounced it shameful that 15 years of loyalty should count for so little in practical terms. And she heard them a third time in the chemist's shop, where Dr. Haydock himself remarked that Mrs. Crane had been absolutely indispensable to Mr. Rowley's comfort. He would have been quite helpless without her, Dr. Haydock said, selecting a bottle of liniment from the shelf. She managed everything, his meals, his correspondence, his household accounts. He relied on her completely. Miss Marple, who was waiting to collect a prescription for her rheumatism, smiled gently. It is interesting, is it not, Doctor, how we speak of such arrangements. We say a person relies on someone, or cannot manage without them, as though dependency were entirely one-sided. But I have often noticed that the person who makes themselves indispensable derives a certain satisfaction from that position. It provides purpose, certainly, but also a kind of power. Dr. Haydock looked at her with the expression of one who has not quite followed a train of thought. I suppose so, though I cannot say I see much power in making tea and sorting the post. Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though knowing everything about a person's habits and preferences, managing their daily comfort, being present for every decision, that is a considerable degree of influence when one thinks about it. The doctor made some non-committal reply and departed, but Miss Marple's words had crystallized something that had been forming in her mind for several days. She had been listening to how people spoke of Mrs. Crane, and more importantly, how Mrs. Crane spoke of herself. That very afternoon provided another illustration. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crane outside the draper's shop, and they walked together for a short distance. Mrs. Crane carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and her manner suggested someone performing necessary duties with admirable efficiency. I am sorting through Mr. Rowley's effects, she explained. His nephew has asked me to prepare a thorough inventory, though I scarcely need to, as I know the contents of every drawer and cupboard. After all these years, one could hardly fail to know. 15 years is indeed a long time, Miss Marple observed. You must feel quite at sea without your usual responsibilities. I confess the house feels strange now that he is gone. Not sad, precisely, but empty of purpose. Everything I did was organised around his needs, his preferences, his schedule. One forgets, after so long, how to arrange a day according to one's own inclinations. They paused at the corner, and Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Crane stood, shoulders squared, chin lifted, as though facing some invisible challenge. The village speaks most warmly of your devotion, Miss Marple said. Everyone agrees that Mr. Rowley was most fortunate in his housekeeper. I like to think I gave satisfaction, Mrs. Crane replied, and there was a note of something, pride perhaps, or vindication in her voice. He told me more than once that he could not have managed without me. In the early years his house was quite disorganised. His mother had kept things in good order, but after her death, before I arrived, everything had fallen into disarray. I brought system and routine to his life. He acknowledged that freely. I am sure he was grateful. Gratitude, Mrs. Crane said, and paused as though testing the word. Yes, he expressed gratitude. Often, in fact. He would say, I don't know what I should do without you, Mrs. Crane, or you're quite invaluable to me. After 15 years, one becomes accustomed to such remarks. One comes to expect them. Miss Marple detected something beneath the words. Not quite bitterness, but a kind of insistence, as though Mrs. Crane were justifying herself to some unseen audience. And yet gratitude, however sincere, does not always translate into material security, she ventured carefully. Mrs. Crane's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. No, it does not, though I am not one to complain. I have my health and some savings. I shall manage well enough. Better, perhaps, than some might expect. There was an odd defiance in this last statement, and Miss Marple found herself wondering what lay behind it. They parted company shortly thereafter, but the conversation lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts as she continued homeward. That evening, having taken her light supper, she settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, and allowed her mind to range over all she'd learned. The village spoke of Mrs. Crane's devotion with universal approval, but devotion, Miss Marple reflected, was a complicated sentiment. It could mask other feelings entirely, resentment at one situation, frustration at being taken for granted, even a smouldering anger at being valued without being truly valued. She thought of how Mrs. Crane spoke, always of what she'd given, what she had sacrificed, how indispensable she had been. Never with the warmth of genuine affection, but with the accounting precision of one tallying debts. After all these years, she had said, and in those words Miss Marple heard not contentment, but claim. There was a story Miss Marple remembered from long ago, about a housemaid who had served the same family for 20 years, and had come to believe that the house was as much hers as theirs, that her years of service had earned her more than wages and thanks. When the family had proposed to retire to a smaller establishment, the housemaid had felt it as a personal betrayal, a negation of everything she had given. The situation had ended badly, though Miss Marple could no longer recall the precise details, but she remembered the principle, that sometimes people confuse being needed with being entitled, that gratitude expected too long becomes gratitude demanded, and that the phrase, I gave my life to you, could sound very much like, you owe me your life. Mrs. Crane had been indispensable for 15 years. She had organised Mr. Rowley's existence, managed his comfort, known his every habit, and Mr. Rowley, with his talk of changes and new arrangements, had perhaps suggested that this state of affairs might not continue indefinitely. What would such a suggestion mean to someone who had invested 15 years in being invaluable? Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the quiet room. She thought of the tea that had cooled too quickly because it was never drunk. She thought of the window open to dissipate something in the air. She thought of the letter examined before death, not after, by someone searching for reassurance about their future. And she thought of Mrs. Crane's voice saying, after all these years, with that note of rigid certainty, as though time itself created obligation, as though long service purchased rights that superseded all other considerations. Gratitude, Miss Marple reflected, was a treacherous foundation on which to build one's sense of security. It could be withdrawn at any moment, for any reason, leaving one with nothing but the memory of years spent and the terrible question of what those years had been worth. Some people, faced with such uncertainty, simply accepted it and moved forward. Others could not bear it. The question was not whether Mrs. Crane felt entitled to more than she had received. The question was what she had been willing to do to prevent losing what she had come to regard as rightfully hers. Chapter 6. The Comfort of Easy Suspects. By the middle of the following week, St. Mary Mead had moved past the immediate shock of Mr. Rowley's death, and had begun to engage in that form of speculation which provides villages with much of their entertainment. It was perhaps inevitable that attention should turn, however briefly, to those figures who stood most obviously to benefit from the deceased gentleman's passing. Miss Marple first became aware of this shift in focus when she encountered Miss Hartnell in the post office. That lady, never one to keep her opinions to herself, was holding forth to the postmaster about Gerald Rowley's sudden appearance. "Of course he came at once," Miss Hartnell declared, her voice carrying clearly across the small shop. "One always does when there's an inheritance involved. Not that I suggest anything improper, you understand, but young men from London are not generally known for their devotion to elderly uncles unless there's something to be gained by it." The postmaster, a tactful man who had learned over many years to navigate village opinion without endorsing it, made some neutral observation about family duty. Miss Harple, however, was not to be deterred. "I heard from the vicar's wife that Mr. Rowley left his nephew a modest sum, enough to be comfortable but hardly a fortune. Still, young people today have such expectations, and there was that business about changes to the will. One wonders if the nephew knew about those proposed changes and what they might have meant to his prospects." Miss Marple, collecting her stamps, allowed herself a gentle interruption. "I understood that Gerald Rowley was in London when his uncle died. Surely that places him quite beyond suspicion, if suspicion were to be entertained at all." "Oh, as to that," Miss Hartnell said, waving her hand dismissively. "Distance means nothing nowadays. People can travel from London to St. Mary Mead and back again in a matter of hours. Not that I'm suggesting he did, of course. Though he did arrive very promptly after the death, did he not?" Miss Marple refrained from pointing out that arriving promptly after being informed of a death was rather different from arriving before it. Instead, she noted mildly that Mrs. Crane's letter would have taken at least a day to reach London, and that young Mr. Rowley's arrival the following evening seemed entirely consistent with innocent haste. But if Miss Hartnell's theories about the nephew were easily dismissed, another name began to circulate with more persistent whispers. Mrs. Lowe, it seemed, had not escaped the village's investigative tendencies. It was Lady Bantry who brought this intelligence to Miss Marple, calling at the cottage on Thursday afternoon with an air of someone bearing important news. "My dear, the most extraordinary thing. Do you remember that dispute between Mrs. Lowe and Mr. Rowley over the boundary hedge? It happened perhaps 2 years ago, when Mrs. Lowe first moved into her house. Apparently she believed the hedge encroached on her property by several feet, and suggested it be cut back. Mr. Rowley refused quite emphatically, saying the hedge had stood in that position for 40 years and would remain there." "I do recall hearing something of it," Miss Marple said, pouring tea for her visitor, "though I understood the matter was resolved amicably." "So it was eventually. Mrs. Lowe withdrew her complaint. But, and here is the interesting part, Mrs. Finch at the bakery mentioned that Mrs. Lowe seemed quite bitter about it at the time, said she felt Mr. Rowley had been unreasonably stubborn, and had made her feel unwelcome in the neighbourhood." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Mrs. Lowe has called on Mr. Rowley every Wednesday afternoon for some months now. That hardly suggests lingering resentment." "No, indeed, which is why I put no credence in the theory myself. But you know how villagers are. Once someone starts wondering aloud, others take up the theme. Inspector Slack was in the village this morning, and I'm told Miss Hartnell made a point of mentioning both the nephew and Mrs. Lowe to him." "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple observed, "is a sensible man when he chooses to be, though he sometimes mistakes confidence for competence. What did he make of these suggestions?" "He dismissed them both, rather brusquely from what I heard. Said there was no evidence of foul play whatsoever, that Dr. Haydock's diagnosis of heart failure was perfectly clear, and that people would do better to mind their own affairs than to invent mysteries where none existed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very forthright of him." "He did add," Lady Bantry continued, helping herself to a biscuit, "that if there had been anything suspicious about Mr. Rowley's death, the most obvious person with both means and opportunity would have been Mrs. Crane, and since she had been devoted to the man for 15 years and had no conceivable motive, all this talk of nephews and neighbours was utter nonsense." This statement gave Miss Marple pause. It was, she reflected, entirely logical from Inspector Slack's perspective. Mrs. Crane had been present when Mr. Rowley died, Mrs. Crane had served the tea. Mrs. Crane had access to every corner of the house and garden. But Inspector Slack had concluded that the absence of an apparent motive rendered these facts irrelevant. He had in effect looked directly at the truth and dismissed it, because it did not conform to his expectations. It was a common enough failing, Miss Marple knew. People expected murderers to be obviously malevolent, obviously greedy, or obviously desperate. They did not expect them to be quietly resentful housekeepers who had served tea for 15 years and who spoke always of gratitude rather than affection. "I suppose," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Inspector Slack is correct in his assessment that Mrs. Crane had no financial motive. The bequest she received was modest, I understand. Yes, though adequate for her immediate needs. The bulk of the estate goes to the nephew, with various small bequests to charities. I had this from the vicar, who had it from the solicitor in Much Benham. Mrs. Crane receives £200 and may remain in the house for 3 months while she seeks new employment." "I see. And had Mr. Rowley mentioned these provisions to her?" "I cannot say. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "I merely wondered whether Mrs. Crane knew what to expect. Uncertainty about one's future can be most distressing, particularly after many years of settled routine." Lady Bantry looked at her friend with sudden interest. "My dear Jane, you're not suggesting. Surely you don't think—" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple said firmly. "I am merely observing that villages are very quick to look for dramatic suspects. The greedy relative, the quarrelsome neighbour, while overlooking the person who stands closest, who knows the most, and who has the most to lose from any change in circumstances, not financially perhaps, but in terms of position, purpose, and that sense of security that comes from being indispensable. But Mrs. Crane was devoted to Mr. Rowley. Everyone says so." "Everyone says so," Miss Marple agreed, "including Mrs. Crane herself, rather frequently in fact. But I have noticed that people who are truly devoted tend to speak more of the person to whom they are devoted than of their own devotion. Mrs. Crane speaks almost exclusively of what she gave, what she sacrificed, how necessary she was. That is not the language of affection, Lady Bantry. It is the language of accounting." Lady Bantry was silent for a moment, digesting this observation. "You know," she said slowly, "when you put it that way, I realise I've never heard Mrs. Crane say a single warm thing about Mr. Rowley as a person. She speaks of his habits, his requirements, his dependence on her, but never of any real fondness or regard." "Precisely. And when someone has invested 15 years in being indispensable, and then hears talk of changes and new arrangements, the threat is not to their finances, but to their entire sense of self. Who is Mrs. Crane without Mr. Rowley's household to manage? What is she if she is no longer the one who knows everything, controls everything, makes everything run smoothly?" "Good heavens," Lady Bantry said softly. "When you explain it like that, it sounds quite desperate." "Desperation," Miss Marple said, "need not be loud or dramatic. Indeed, the quietest desperation is often the most dangerous, because it has time to plan, to prepare, to convince itself that what it intends is not murder, but simply the preservation of what rightfully belongs to it." She rose to refill the teapot, and Lady Bantry watched her with something approaching awe. "Jane, do you truly believe Mrs. Crane killed Mr. Rowley?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that 3 small things do not align with natural death. I believe that Mrs. Crane speaks like someone defending a claim rather than mourning a loss. And I believe that Inspector Slack, in dismissing her as a suspect because she seemed devoted, has made the very error that allows such crimes to succeed. But belief is not proof, and without proof, there is nothing to be done." "What sort of proof would you need?" Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I should need to understand exactly what happened on Wednesday afternoon. Not what Mrs. Crane says happened, but what the evidence suggests happened. The tea, the window, the letter, each tells part of a story. I need to see how they fit together." "And if they do fit together in the way you suspect?" "Then," Miss Marple said quietly, We must hope that Inspector Slack is willing to listen, and that Mrs. Crane's conscience, if she has one, proves more burdensome than she anticipated. But these matters are delicate. One cannot go about accusing people of murder without being quite certain of one's ground. Lady Bantry agreed to this with feeling, and soon afterward took her leave. Miss Marple, left alone, sat for some time in her chair, watching the afternoon light fade across her garden. The village had looked for easy suspects and found none, which was exactly as it should be. Mrs. Crane was not an easy suspect. She was a difficult one, requiring not dramatic evidence but careful observation of small inconsistencies, and the understanding that murder could grow from resentment as easily as from greed, and from threatened security as readily as from passion. Chapter 7. What Long Service Teaches. It was on Friday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Mr. Rowley's death, that Miss Marple learned the detail that transformed her suspicions into something approaching certainty. She had not been seeking information, for she had learned long ago that the most revealing truths often arrive unbidden, emerging from the ordinary flow of village conversation like stones revealed by receding water. She had stopped at the greengrocer's to select vegetables for her weekend meals, and found herself in conversation with Mrs. Patterson, whose son helped with various gardens about the village. Mrs. Patterson was a garrulous woman with a tendency to repeat herself, but Miss Marple had discovered that patient listening often yielded unexpected rewards. "My Tom was quite upset about Mr. Rowley's passing," Mrs. Patterson said, weighing out potatoes with careful attention. "He'd been working in that garden for 3 years, and Mr. Rowley always had a kind word for him. Not like some, who treat a garden as though he were part of the furniture." "Your son maintains the garden very well," Miss Marple observed. "The borders are always neat and the flowers beautifully tended." "That's mostly Mrs. Crane's doing, truth be told. She's particular about the garden, more so than Mr. Rowley ever was. She'd have Tom trim things back even when they looked perfectly fine to me. The foxgloves, for instance. Lovely tall plants they were, but she had him cut away all the old flower stalks the very morning before Mr. Rowley died. Said they looked untidy." Miss Marple's hands stilled on the carrots she'd been examining. "The very morning?" "Wednesday morning, yes. Tom was there from 8 until 9:30, cutting back the dead stalks and tidying the border. Mrs. Crane stood at the window watching him work, which struck Tom as odd. Usually she just tells him what wants doing and leaves him to it, but that morning she watched the whole time, as though she wanted to be certain he did it properly." "Perhaps she was merely taking an interest," Miss Marple suggested carefully. "Perhaps. Though Tom said she seemed nervous somehow, kept looking at the clock and asking if he'd be finished soon. He was meant to move on to Lady Bantry's garden at 9:30, and Mrs. Crane seemed anxious that he should be gone by then. Said something about Mr. Rowley not liking noise beneath the sitting-room window, though Tom had been trimming those foxgloves for 3 years, and Mr. Rowley had never complained before." Miss Marple purchased her vegetables and walked home slowly, her mind occupied with this new intelligence. Mrs. Crane had ensured that the foxgloves were trimmed on the very morning of Mr. Rowley's death. She had supervised the work personally, and she had been anxious that it be completed before 9:30, which would have been shortly before Mr. Rowley returned from his daily walk to the post office. The implication was clear enough. Mrs. Crane had wanted those flower stalks available to her, and she had wanted them fresh. Dried foxglove was one thing, but fresh plant material would need to be processed promptly if its properties were to be extracted effectively. That evening Miss Marple took out her notebook, a small leather-bound volume in which she occasionally recorded observations that seemed worthy of preservation, and wrote down a careful timeline of Wednesday morning as she now understood it. 8 o'clock. Tom Patterson begins trimming the foxgloves under Mrs. Crane's watchful eye. 9:30, Tom completes his work and departs. 10 o'clock. Mr. Rowley leaves for his daily walk to the post office. 3:30. Tea is served in the sitting room. 4 o'clock. Mr. Rowley is found dead. Between 9:30 and 3:30, Mrs. Crane would have had ample time to prepare an infusion from the fresh foxglove stalks. The method was not difficult. Miss Marple had once consulted a herbal medicine book in the village library and recalled that foxglove required only steeping in hot water, though the dosage would need to be carefully judged. Too little would merely sicken, too much would kill, but perhaps too obviously. The following morning, Miss Marple contrived to encounter Gerald Rowley, who was staying at the local inn while he completed the necessary arrangements for his uncle's estate. She found him taking solitary breakfast in the small dining room, and he invited her to join him for coffee with the eagerness of someone glad of company. "I return to London tomorrow," he told her. "The solicitor has everything in hand, and Mrs. Crane has been most efficient in preparing the inventory. She knows that house better than anyone could, I suspect. Every item catalogued with its location and approximate value." "She's been with your uncle a long time," Miss Marple observed. "Such lengthy service must have created a strong attachment." Gerald Rowley stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Attachment is an interesting word, Miss Marple. I confess I'm not entirely certain what Mrs. Crane felt toward my uncle. Duty certainly, pride in her competence without question. But affection?" He shook his head slightly. "When I've spoken to her these past days, she refers constantly to what she did for him, never to anything he might have been as a person. It's as though he existed primarily as a vehicle for her capabilities." "Perhaps that is how she needed to see the relationship," Miss Marple suggested. "Some people find it easier to think of service as something given rather than something chosen. It absolves them of the responsibility of examining whether they are happy." "There is something else," Gerald said, lowering his voice though they were alone in the room. "I happened to mention to Mrs. Crane that Uncle Stephen had written to me about making changes to his will. I thought it only proper to tell her, since she might have been concerned about her own provision. Do you know what she said?" Miss Marple waited, her expression attentive. "She said, 'He mentioned that to me as well, on Tuesday evening, as it happens. We discussed it quite thoroughly.' And then she added, 'Miss Marple,' and these were her exact words. I told him that after all these years I had certain expectations. But Mr. Rowley could be remarkably stubborn when he chose." The way she said it, there was such coldness in her voice. "And how did your uncle respond to her statement of expectations?" "According to Mrs. Crane, he said he would consider the matter carefully. But she seemed to think he had already made up his mind against any substantial provision for her. She said he had been impossibly fixed in his views lately." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a sense of pieces falling into place. Here was the conversation that had precipitated everything. The discussion on Tuesday evening in which Mrs. Crane had learned that 15 years of service would not, after all, guarantee her security. Mr. Rowley had been considering changes, and those changes apparently did not favour his housekeeper as much as she believed she deserved. And the very next morning Mrs. Crane had arranged for the foxgloves to be trimmed, watching anxiously from the window to ensure the work was completed in time. Mr. Rowley, Miss Marple said carefully, had every right to dispose of his property as he saw fit, but I can understand how such news might have been difficult for Mrs. Crane to accept, particularly if she had convinced herself that her long service entitled her to more consideration. "Entitled is exactly the word," Gerald said. "That's how she spoke, as though she had earned something beyond mere wages and thanks. I found it rather disturbing, to be honest." Miss Marple finished her coffee and took her leave shortly thereafter, but her mind was now quite made up. Mrs. Crane had learned on Tuesday evening that her expectations would not be met. On Wednesday morning she had supervised the preparation of her means. By Wednesday afternoon Mr. Rowley was dead, and his will, unchanged, left her with security for 3 months and a modest sum. But 3 months and £200 would have been infinitely preferable to Mrs. Crane than the prospect of being dismissed, of starting again, of admitting that 15 years of being indispensable had not, in the end, made her indispensable at all. Chapter 8. When small details refuse to agree. Miss Marple had always believed that understanding came not from one large revelation, but from the patient assembly of many small observations, each insufficient on its own but powerful in combination. She had the pieces now scattered across 2 weeks of careful attention, and it was time to see how they fitted together. She sat in her parlour on Saturday morning with her notebook open before her. though she scarcely needed to consult it. The facts had arranged themselves in her mind with a clarity that left little room for doubt, yet doubt was essential. One could not accuse a person of murder based on inference alone, however compelling that inference might be. The first detail, the cup of tea that Mr. Rowley had not drunk, though he was famous for never letting tea go cold. Mrs. Crane had washed that cup before anyone thought to examine it closely, removing whatever evidence it might have contained. A guilty action? Or simply the automatic tidying of a housekeeper accustomed to order? Taken alone, it proved nothing. The second detail, the window opened behind Mr. Rowley's chair, though he disliked draughts and had said so repeatedly. Mrs. Crane claimed he liked fresh air, but Mrs. Lowe's recollection contradicted this, and beneath that window grew foxglove, trimmed on the very morning of his death under Mrs. Crane's anxious supervision. Coincidence? Perhaps. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to be suspicious of convenient coincidences. The third detail, the letter from Gerald Rowley, folded once instead of twice, smelling of garden leaves, and opened before Mr. Rowley's death despite Mrs. Crane's claim that she had opened it afterward. A woman searching for reassurance, perhaps. A woman who needed to know if the nephew's correspondence contained anything about the proposed changes to the will. 3 small inconsistencies, each defensible on its own. But together they told a story of preparation, execution, and concealment. Miss Marple closed her notebook and sat very still, considering what must be done. The difficulty lay not in understanding what had happened, but in proving it. Dr. Haydock had certified heart failure, which was not inaccurate. Foxglove poisoning worked by affecting the heart, causing it to beat irregularly until it stopped. The symptoms could easily be mistaken for natural cardiac arrest, particularly in an elderly man who had complained of feeling unwell. Without an autopsy, without examination of the tea, without any physical evidence, how could one demonstrate that Mr. Rowley had been murdered? And yet Miss Marple knew, with that quiet certainty that came from understanding human nature rather than physical evidence, that Mrs. Crane had killed her employer. She'd done so not in passion or panic, but with patient deliberation, believing herself justified by years of service and the threat of losing everything she had built her life around. The question was whether Mrs. Crane herself fully understood what she had done. In Miss Marple's experience, some murderers knew themselves to be guilty and lived in constant fear of discovery. Others convinced themselves that their actions had been necessary, even righteous, and felt aggrieved when questioned about them. Mrs. Crane, she suspected, belonged to the latter category. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Slack at the police station in Much Benham. He received her with the tolerant exasperation of a man who has dealt with elderly ladies and their theories before and found them universally unprofitable. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing her to a chair with perfunctory courtesy, "what brings you to see me? Not more speculation about Mr. Rowley's death, I hope. The matter is quite settled. Natural causes certified by Dr. Haydock." "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if you would indulge me in a hypothetical question, Inspector." Slack sighed, but nodded permission. "If one were to poison someone with foxglove," Miss Marple continued in her mild conversational tone, "what would be the symptoms?" "Foxglove?" Slack's expression sharpened slightly. "Digitalis poisoning, you mean? Well, it affects the heart primarily. Irregular heartbeat, nausea, visual disturbances, confusion. Death would come from cardiac arrest. Why do you ask? And would such a death be easily distinguished from natural heart failure? Not without an autopsy and toxicology examination, no. The symptoms are similar enough that a doctor might well certify natural causes, particularly in an elderly patient with a history of heart complaints." Slack leaned forward, his tone becoming less patient. "Miss Marple, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting about Mr. Rowley, I must tell you that you're wasting both your time and mine. There's no evidence of foul play whatsoever." "No evidence because none was sought," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Tell me, Inspector, Did you know that foxglove grows beneath the sitting-room window where Mr. Rowley died, and that it was trimmed on the very morning of his death, under Mrs. Crane's direct supervision? Garden maintenance is hardly evidence of murder. Perhaps not, but consider this sequence of events. On Tuesday evening, Mr. Rowley informed Mrs. Crane that he was considering changes to his will that would not benefit her substantially. On Wednesday morning, she arranged for fresh foxglove stalks to be cut. That afternoon, Mr. Rowley died before drinking tea that had grown cold, most unusual for a man who hated cold tea. The cup was washed immediately, the window behind his chair was open, though he disliked draughts, and a letter on his desk was opened before his death, though Mrs. Crane claimed she opened it afterward. Slack was silent now, his expression thoughtful. Each detail is small, Miss Marple continued. Each could be explained away, but together, Inspector, they form a pattern. Mrs. Crane was devoted to Mr. Rowley. Everyone says so. But devotion that masks resentment, that speaks always of sacrifice and expectation rather than affection, can become dangerous when threatened with loss. Even if I accepted your theory, Slack said slowly, what would you have me do? We cannot exhume a body based on the fact that someone washed a teacup and trimmed some flowers. No, Miss Marple agreed, but you could speak to Mrs. Crane. You could mention the foxglove, the opened letter, the cold tea. You could observe her reaction. Sometimes, Inspector, guilt reveals itself not through confession, but through the inability to bear one's own knowledge in silence. Slack drummed his fingers on the desk. You're asking me to confront a respectable woman with accusations of murder, based on circumstantial observations and the timing of garden work. I am asking you to consider the possibility that 15 years of being indispensable, followed by the threat of being dispensed with, might drive someone to protect what they had come to regard as rightfully theirs. Mrs. Crane did not kill for money, Inspector. She killed to prevent loss of position, of purpose, of the life she had constructed around being needed. That is a powerful motive, though not an obvious one. Inspector Slack sat back in his chair regarding Miss Marple with an expression that mingled respect with reluctance. And if she denies everything? If she maintains her innocence? Then perhaps she will succeed in maintaining it, Miss Marple said calmly. But I suspect, Inspector, that Mrs. Crane is not entirely at peace with what she has done. The human conscience is a remarkable thing. It can be silenced for a time, but it rarely stays silent forever. Sometimes all it needs is the knowledge that someone else understands, someone else sees the truth. She rose to leave, and Slack did not immediately dismiss her. I'll consider what you've said, he told her finally, though I make no promises. That is all I ask, Miss Marple replied. The truth has a way of emerging whether we assist it or not, but assistance, when properly given, can spare everyone a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Chapter 9. 3 quiet signs, 1 conclusion. Inspector Slack appeared in St. Mary Mead on Monday morning, his arrival noted by the postmaster and duly reported throughout the village by noon. He went directly to Mr. Rowley's house, where Mrs. Crane was still engaged in sorting the deceased's effects, and he remained there for nearly 2 hours. Miss Marple learned of the visit from her parlour window, for she had positioned herself there with her knitting after breakfast, acknowledging to herself that curiosity, while not always admirable, was sometimes necessary. She saw the inspector arrive, noted the set of his shoulders that suggested determined purpose, and waited with the patience of one who understands that certain processes cannot be hurried. When Inspector Slack emerged at last, he walked directly to Miss Marple's cottage and was shown into her parlour by her maid. His expression was difficult to read, neither triumphant nor defeated, but rather thoughtful in a way that suggested he had encountered something unexpected. You were right, he said without preamble, accepting the chair Miss Marple offered. Not about everything, perhaps, but about enough. Mrs. Crane has confessed to administering foxglove to Mr. Rowley's tea on Wednesday afternoon. Miss Marple set down her knitting carefully. I see. And how did she explain her actions? She didn't. Not in any way that made moral sense. She maintained that she had done nothing wrong, that Mr. Rowley had forced her to act through his unreasonableness. She said and these were very nearly her exact words. After 15 years, I had earned the right to security. He was going to dismiss me, or reduce my position, all because of his nephew's influence. I could not allow that to happen. She believed the nephew was encouraging the changes. She convinced herself of it, though young Rowley had done no such thing. His letter, which she opened on Wednesday morning, as you surmised, contained nothing more than ordinary family news and a response to some questions about his aunt's jewellery. But Mrs. Crane interpreted every word as evidence of conspiracy against her interests. Miss Marple poured tea, noting with some irony that the inspector accepted his cup readily enough, though he had so recently been discussing poisoned tea. Tell me how you approached her, if you will. I confess to some curiosity about what prompted the confession. Slack stirred sugar into his tea with methodical attention. I followed your advice, though I had my doubts. I told her that I had received new information about Mr. Rowley's death, and wished to clarify certain details. I mentioned the foxglove beneath the window, noting that it had been trimmed on the morning he died. I asked about the opened letter, and about why she had washed the teacup so quickly. And her response? She maintained her composure at first, explaining each point much as she had explained it to you, but when I mentioned that foxglove poisoning produces symptoms very similar to heart failure, and that the combination of circumstances, the trimmed plants, the cold tea, the opened window, suggested someone had both means and opportunity, she became very still. Not frightened precisely, more resigned, as though she had been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had arrived. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Guilt is a heavy burden to carry alone. Sometimes discovery comes as a release, however unwelcome the consequences. She said something quite remarkable then, Slack continued. She said, I suppose you think me wicked, but I am not. I merely protected what was mine. He would have died soon enough anyway. His heart was weak. I only hastened what was inevitable, and I did it to preserve what I had earned through years of devoted service. She actually used the word earned, Miss Marple, as though murder were simply collecting a debt. She does not see it as murder, Miss Marple said quietly. She sees it as self-preservation, as claiming what 15 years of labour entitled her to receive. That is what makes such crimes possible. The murderer's conviction that they are not truly guilty, that circumstances forced them to act, that they are in fact the injured party. She showed me where she prepared the infusion, Slack said, in the scullery using the stalks Tom Patterson had cut that morning. She said she'd studied herbal remedies years ago and knew that foxglove, properly prepared, would affect the heart quickly. She added it to the teapot while Mrs. Lowe was being shown in, knowing that the flavour would be masked by the tea itself. And the window? Opened afterward, while Mrs. Lowe was leaving. Mrs. Crane escorted her to the door, then returned and opened the window, concerned that the room might retain some scent from the preparation. She'd handled the fresh plant material, you see, and feared the smell might linger. That's why she washed the cup immediately as well, to remove any trace before the doctor arrived. She planned it very carefully, Miss Marple observed. Yes, too carefully in some ways. If she had simply let the evidence remain undisturbed, it might have been accepted as natural death without question. But her very thoroughness in removing evidence created the inconsistencies that caught your attention. Slack paused, regarding Miss Marple with something approaching respect. How did you know to look for these details? Most people would have accepted the obvious explanation. Most people do not spend their lives observing human nature in small, closed communities, Miss Marple replied. I have seen what happens when someone invests their entire identity in a single role, a single relationship, a single household. When that foundation is threatened, the response can be extreme. Mrs. Crane was not Mr. Rowley's housekeeper. She was his indispensable housekeeper. Remove that identity, and what remained? A 52-year-old widow with no family, no home, and no particular prospects. That is a terrifying prospect for anyone. Terrifying enough to justify murder. Terrifying enough to make murder seem like the only option, which is not quite the same thing. Mrs. Crane convinced herself that she was simply protecting what belonged to her, that Mr. Rowley's life was less important than her security. It is a remarkably selfish calculation, but not an uncommon one. People are capable of extraordinary rationalization when their survival, as they perceive it, is at stake. Inspector Slack finished his tea and set down the cup with a definite clink. She will be charged with murder, of course. The confession is clear enough, and her own description of her actions leaves no room for doubt. She maintains even now that she did nothing truly wrong, merely acted with appropriate decisiveness when faced with an impossible situation. She will maintain that until the end, Miss Marple said. Some people cannot afford to acknowledge their guilt, for to do so would require them to see themselves as they truly are, and that vision would be unbearable. Mrs. Crane will go to her trial, and possibly to the gallows, convinced that she was the victim of Mr. Rowley's unreasonableness, rather than the architect of his death. Slack stood to leave, and Miss Marple accompanied him to the door. Before departing, he turned back to her with an expression of reluctant curiosity. "Tell me, Miss Marple, when did you first suspect that Mr. Rowley had been murdered?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I did not suspect murder at first, Inspector. I merely noticed that certain small things did not agree with what I knew of Mr. Rowley's character and habits. A man who never let his tea go cold, a man who dislikes draughts, a man who folded his letters precisely. Each inconsistency was small, but collectively they suggested interruption, preparation, concealment. And once I understood that someone had interfered with the natural pattern of that afternoon, the question became not whether there had been murder, but who had the means, the opportunity, and above all, the motive that made murder seem necessary rather than evil. And the motive was the threat of losing her position. More than that, the threat of losing her reason for existing. Mrs. Crane had made herself indispensable over 15 years, and in doing so she had made Mr. Rowley's continued need for her the foundation of her entire sense of self. When he suggested that foundation might crumble, she chose to remove him rather than face the collapse of everything she had built. It is a sad business, Inspector, but not an incomprehensible one. After Slack departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon stretched before her, peaceful and ordinary, as though nothing of significance had occurred. But somewhere across the village Mrs. Crane was being taken into custody, and the house where she'd reigned for 15 years stood empty at last. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. 3 small clues had revealed the truth. A cup that cooled too quickly because it was never meant to be drunk, a window open to disperse the scent of preparation, and a letter folded the wrong way because it had been opened in anxiety rather than in grief. Small things but significant. In Miss Marple's experience they always were. Chapter 10. How the Village Learned to See. The arrest of Mrs. Crane created in St. Mary Mead that particular form of shock which comes not from violence or spectacle, but from the quiet overturning of accepted truths. For 3 weeks the village had spoken of her devotion, her efficiency, her 15 years of exemplary service. Now those same virtues took on a different complexion, and people who had praised her dedication found themselves wondering whether they had ever truly known her at all. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the calm interest of one who has seen such reversals before. The human tendency, she reflected, was to revise the past in light of present knowledge, to claim that one had always suspected something amiss. By Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Mrs. Crane's confession, the village had already begun to remember things differently. "I always thought she seemed rather cold," Miss Hartnell declared in the post office. "Too controlled, if you understand me. Not a natural warmth about her at all." Miss Marple, who recalled Miss Hartnell praising that very control as admirable composure, said nothing. People needed to protect themselves from their own misjudgments, and contradicting them served no useful purpose. Lady Bantry, calling at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, was more honest in her discomfort. "I feel quite foolish, Jane," she admitted, settling into her accustomed chair. "I spoke warmly of Mrs. Crane's devotion, recommended her character to others, and all the while she had murdered her employer in cold blood. How could I have been so blind?" "You were not blind," Miss Marple said gently, pouring tea with careful attention. "You saw what Mrs. Crane showed you, which was competence, efficiency, and the appearance of dedication. One cannot fault oneself for failing to detect what was deliberately concealed. Mrs. Crane had 15 years to perfect her presentation. She became expert at displaying the qualities people expected to see. But you saw through it. You understood what she really was." "I saw small inconsistencies," Miss Marple corrected. "I did not immediately perceive Mrs. Crane's guilt, but I noticed when things did not fit together properly. A teacup washed too quickly, a window opened against habit, a letter that told a different story from the one presented. These details accumulated until they formed a pattern, but the pattern was not obvious at first." Lady Bantry sipped her tea thoughtfully. "The vicar's wife says Mrs. Crane shows no remorse whatsoever. She maintains that she acted appropriately given the circumstances, that Mr. Rowley forced her hand by his unreasonableness about the will." "She must maintain that position," Miss Marple observed. "To acknowledge guilt would require her to admit that 15 years of service did not, in fact, entitle her to determine whether Mr. Rowley should live or die. That admission would destroy the entire edifice of justification she has constructed. It is easier to believe oneself wronged than wicked. It makes one wonder about all the housekeepers, companions, and servants one encounters. How many of them harbour such resentments?" "Very few, I should think," Miss Marple said with quiet assurance. "Most people who enter service do so with clear understanding of the relationship and its limitations. They give good work and receive fair compensation, and when the employment ends, they move forward without bitterness. Mrs. Crane's error was in conflating service with ownership, in believing that managing Mr. Rowley's household entitled her to manage his decisions, his property, and ultimately his life. Still, it is unsettling. One hires people into one's home, trusts them with intimate knowledge of one's affairs, and never quite knows what thoughts they harbour." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "One could say the same of any relationship, could one not? We never fully know what others think or feel. We trust that most people possess sufficient conscience and common sense to act decently, and mostly that trust is warranted. Mrs. Crane represents the exception, not the rule. If we allowed exceptional cases to poison our general interactions, we should never trust anyone at all, which would make life quite impossible." This perspective seemed to comfort Lady Bantry, and the conversation drifted to other matters. But after her guest departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in contemplation, thinking about Mrs. Crane and what her case revealed about the darker possibilities of human nature. It was not greed that had driven the murder, nor passion, nor even desperation in the ordinary sense. It was something more insidious, the gradual transformation of service into entitlement, of gratitude into debt, of being needed into having rights. Mrs. Crane had spent 15 years making herself indispensable, and in doing so she'd forgotten that indispensability was a relationship, not a contract, and that Mr. Rowley retained the ultimate authority over his own household and his own life. The trial, when it came in late June, was brief and definitive. Mrs. Crane maintained her composure throughout, answering questions with the same brisk efficiency she had brought to household management. She explained her actions without visible emotion, describing the preparation of the foxglove infusion as one might describe making an ordinary cup of tea. When asked if she felt remorse, she stated simply that she'd done what was necessary to protect her interests after 15 years of devoted service. The jury required less than an hour to return a verdict of guilty. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, observed that Mrs. Crane's complete lack of remorse and her persistent belief in her own righteousness left the court no option but the severest penalty. She received the sentence without visible reaction, and was led away still maintaining that she had been wronged, rather than that she had done wrong. Miss Marple did not attend the trial, feeling that her presence would serve no useful purpose. She learned the outcome from Inspector Slack, who called at her cottage the following day to inform her of the verdict. "She never wavered," he told Miss Marple. Right to the end, she insisted that Mr. Rowley's unreasonableness had forced her to act. Even the judge's remarks seemed to puzzle her, as though she could not understand why people failed to see the justice of her position. She has convinced herself so thoroughly that I doubt she will ever see it differently, Miss Marple said. Some people, when faced with the choice between acknowledging guilt and maintaining their own sense of righteousness, will choose righteousness every time regardless of the cost. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon in her garden, attending to her roses and thinking about the strange case of Mr. Rowley's death. 3 small clues had revealed a murder that might otherwise have passed as natural death. A cup of tea that cooled because it was never meant to be drunk, a window opened to disperse the scent of guilt, and a letter folded carelessly because it had been opened in anxiety rather than in grief. Small things, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder was rarely announced with trumpets and drama. More often it came quietly, shaped by patience and grievance, executed by someone trusted and familiar, someone who had been needed too long, thanked too often, and questioned too little. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple came indoors and prepared her own tea, which she took in her parlour while the light faded. She poured carefully, added 1 lump of sugar as was her custom, and stirred it thoroughly. Then she lifted the cup to her lips and drank while the tea was still hot, as any sensible person would do. The village around her continued its quiet routines, having learned from Mrs. Crane's crime what it perhaps already knew, but had chosen to forget, that even the most ordinary arrangements between people carry hidden complexities, that trust is always partly a leap of faith, and that the appearance of devotion may sometimes mask calculations of a very different kind. But life went on, as it always did. Servants continued to serve, housekeepers continued